So, let me introduce my fellow panellists. Sitting on my right over here is Sandhya. She's a member of the management committee of Southall Black Sisters and a feminist activist from Manchester. She has worked within the specialist and mainstream refuge movement for about 20 years now.
Not quite.
Not quite 20 years.
Nearly.
Nearly 20 years. More recently, she's worked with Oxfam UK on European gender projects and on programmes aimed at black women in the north of England.
A member of the Southall Black Sisters Management Committee, and whilst Southall Black Sisters does many things, it also has a point to make in terms of faith and the rise of religious fundamentalism, an issue that has been at the heart of our work as black women, organising around both anti-fascist but also feminist and secular spaces to protect women and children experiencing violence of all forms. And it's something I think that Hanana brought up in the morning, and I'm really glad that that did come up because it came up in the context of the riots. But it's also uprising, sorry. But it also is part and parcel of our history, part and parcel of who we are, and part and parcel of the communities that we all come from. And women are at the cutting edge of the danger of communalism and religious fundamentalism. So I wanted to do something on that, and Bragna told me to write everything down, which is annoying because now you have me just reading off a piece of paper. So I'll try and not look down too much. But we talked a little bit this morning about that and about how that happened over the years in terms of feminism from the 1970s. And I think we all agree that black communities have had a pretty contentious relationship with the state via the race relation policies and practice. And it has been a very fraught and difficult journey, and a journey that has meant challenging the very heart of the government's response to movement and migration, and our right to have movement and to migrate. So those are perspectives based on colonialism, racism, sexism, class, privilege and control. And for black women, the relationship has been even more fractious, as we have had to deal with the multiple layers of oppression and discrimination that shape the daily realities that we live in under state and patriarchal control. And that's both within and from without our communities. So within our communities, within our ethnic communities, but also into wider society. And that's something that the pictures behind you, our visibility as SBS is something I'm also incredibly proud of, that black women are visible in our own communities and also on the streets of both Southall, but also Westminster, and in Parliament. We are very visible, and I think if the only thing you've got left, the tool you've got left is your voice, then use it well. So since the 1960s, there's been various different strategies employed to help deal with the issue of migrant communities. And I say deal because it is. You're always the other, you're always the problem. There's a real pathologisation around migrant communities that we can see at the moment. I think you alluded to the fact that we have asylum seekers and economic migrants at the moment are being demonised for their very right to exist, very right to have freedom of movement, etc., etc. So there was a real issue about how to manage the influx of people from the Commonwealth communities, arrival of African, Caribbean and Asian to newly arrived asylum seekers and economic migrants. Anti-fascist campaigns and commentators have highlighted the discriminatory ways in which these approaches have impacted on black and minority ethnic communities, not least the emphasis on immigration as a way to manage such communities. But there was a resounding silence when it came to women. There was a resounding silence when black women said, well, what about us? Anti-racism, what about us? With the arrival of the Afro-Caribbean and Asian migrants, the assumption of the government through the 50s to the 70s was that the migrant community and population would become like us, very assimilation, they would be assimilated, I can never say that word, assimilated. They would share their cultural and religious identities, and they would in fact become like us. They would become like majority communities and be absorbed into the British way of life. But this approach, of course, was rendered non-viable for many reasons, not least that it failed to address racism, the inherent xenophobia in majority population, but also the expectation that black people would assimilate into an undefinable British way of life. What British way of life? What is the British way of life? Can we in this room absolutely nail down, and please let's pass it on to Cameron because he doesn't know, what is the British way of life? Because it's multiple, it's many, it's multifold, it's complex. So during the 1970s, after the assimilationist approach, there was a shift towards more multicultural frameworks. So that was the dominant policy approach to race relations. And unlike, I think we heard again this morning, unlike the old assimilation approaches, where communities would expect to shed all their religious and cultural identities, now new policies emphasise the importance of these differences and indeed value these as legitimate identities. These differences are legitimate and to be valued, even at the cost of women, even at the cost of calling forced marriage, for example, a legitimate cultural practice. But they also largely deal with very fixed and static notions of culture. Now, we haven't got enough time, but culture is fluid. Culture is not just, it changes with generations, it changes with demographics, it changes with geography, it changes all the time. And the government's view of ethnic minorities was that culture was this static thing. Asians had that, Africans had that, African Caribbeans had that culture, and that's the way it was. So this was increasingly problematic, a problematic notion under multiculturalism. It also dealt with community groups as homogenous. And SBS and other women's organisations were saying, hang on a minute, you're talking about communities. Looking at communities, identifying their cultural values along the lines of patriarchy. We do not subscribe to this. But unfortunately, our voices were very small within that debate. So, for example, the government wanted to give space and power to community leaders and representatives to best articulate what this new culture, what culture was, what it meant to communities, and how they could articulate and work with those communities. But guess who they gave it to? Guess who those local community representatives were? Guess who those local leaders were? They were not SBS. They were not women from within the community that talked along the lines, across the lines of race and religion and ethnicity and sexuality and all the other things. They were not the secular feminists. They were largely the conservative leaders, male leaders within our communities. So this was a real dangerous development. For Black and Asian women, it was at our expense. Not surprisingly, the community leaders, religious, conservative, not interested in women's rights or gender equality, let alone human rights and further equality debates. And they were concerned with silencing any challenge, resistance or dissenting voices from within BME and other issues, from BME women. And suddenly faith leaders from BME communities were given the go-ahead and legitimacy to speak on our behalf, to be our custodians and to be our representatives. And I remember going to a million meetings where people talked to me, well, which community do you come from? Well, I come from partly the Asian community, various different communities. So you're Muslim then, or you're Sikh then, or you're Hindu? No, I'm not. I come from a feminist community. So defining your own identity became very problematic. And of course, since 9/11 and the uprisings in northern England, July London bombings, faith, and most notably the emphasis on Islam, which I think Hanana talked about as well, has increasingly become the overriding prism through which communities are defined, talked about and dealt with, and therefore the main way in which race relations is now articulated by the government within the community cohesion agenda. This is about promoting integration. So we need to know what culture you have and what community background you come from, so we can integrate properly. The problem is, who defines cultural values? Who defines the values of a whole community? And what happens when there are dissenting and differing voices within community? Extremely difficult. So preventing violence extremism, for example, which was the government's funding to counteract terrorism within Muslim and, they said, faith communities, but predominantly it was based on Muslim communities, led to many groups who had previously identified on the grounds of race and ethnicity, so we're a black women's organisation or we're an Asian women's organisation, suddenly redefining, finding themselves in a situation where they had to redefine themselves as faith, or most particular Muslim, in the bid to access money. So many secular women's groups that I had known of suddenly had to redefine themselves as Muslim women's empowerment groups, etc., etc. And this is from my time with Sue in the North. So it became extremely fractious and extremely dangerous. We were being redefined, and we were having to redefine ourselves to get money. And this marked a significant fragmentation within communities and such a dangerous shift for women's groups. The shift was away from structural forms of racism and sexism and talking about it as that, to faith perspectives, to talking about faith, identifying on the lines of faith, defining ourselves in terms of faith. For secular women's organisations and for atheist women like me, that became incredibly difficult. Why were they asking white women the same thing? Were they asking majority women to define their religion on entry into a refuge or on entry into etc., etc.? You know how it goes. So the extent to which these blanket policies have failed to explore issues of difference and dissent and racism and sexism within communities is an area of challenge for groups like SBS. Specifically, the rise and danger of faith as the main identity. How has the discourse on race and racism been superseded by the discourse on faith and religion? Forced marriage, for example, one of the contentious issues in forced marriage, and the way forced marriage was seen not as in terms of a domestic violence and a particular form of violence predominantly against women but also against men, but it was seen outside. You can say it was exoticised. It was seen outside of domestic violence. It was seen as some kind of cultural practice, and what do we think about this cultural practice? So instead of seeing it exactly as it was, as a form of domestic violence, where women are abused, raped, assaulted, kidnapped, subject to emotional violence, physical violence, sexual violence, etc., 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 the state wanted to think, under the guise of multiculturalism, well, is it a cultural practice? What do we think about that? Guess who they asked? What does the community think about that? They asked the community leaders, well, what do you think about that? And of course, no community leader was going to say, yes, that happens in our community, and isn't it terrible? And yes, we need to do something about patriarchy, etc., etc. No one was going to do that. So it was left up to SBS to constantly say things like, you cannot offer mediation, which was being offered to women. It still is actually being offered to women, but mediation in terms of the couple coming together and perhaps having a sit down, this is how they put it, sitting down with the family and going through some of the issues to see if there is a meeting point where etc., etc., etc. Would mediation be offered to white women who are experiencing domestic violence? No. So why was it being told? Why were we being told that we actually had to deal with this and we actually had to take it on board? SBS was on the forced marriage, the government's forced marriage working group at the time, and actually resigned over the point of mediation. So I'm deeply. I think that was a really important thing that we had to do. So I think we have to start actually analysing the issue of faith and the rise of religious fundamentalism within our communities. And I can see it surreptitiously becoming part and parcel of our main discourse. And if we're not careful, it's going to become a dominant discourse.